Relations between the US and Russia are effectively severed. The top officials of both countries say so. This could lead to a major war and has already led to total world tensions unseen since the Cold War. Now, many people mistakenly think that this has always been the case. America and Russia are such sworn enemies. They are always fighting each other. This has been the case since the Soviet Union, and little has changed since then. In this video, I will show how the relationship between Moscow and Washington has changed and talk about the 90s, the era of warm relations between the two countries. Be sure to watch this video to the end so you don't look like a profane during arguments with your parents in the kitchen. January of '91. President George Bush of the United States declares the need for cooperation with Russia. Just think about it in 2023. It sounds like something impossible, but then it seemed to everyone that the Cold War was over. The two sides would put their differences. In a short period of time, the former adversaries concluded a strategic arms reduction treaty, and in a short period of time, the leaders signed more than 50 agreements, among which the declaration of Boris Yeltsin and George Bush is especially noteworthy, confirming that the United States and Russia no longer view each other as potential adversaries. Vladimir Putin, who succeeded Yeltsin as president, visited the United States almost every year. In turn, the US began to expand the boundaries of NATO influence, which angered the Kremlin for years. Everyone defended their interests, but not everyone was able to do so successfully. Russia maintained a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, but the Kremlin's opinion was no longer as important as it was in Soviet times. On March 24, 1919, Prime Minister Primakov flies to Washington on a government plane to discuss monetary matters with the IMF. During the flight, he receives a call that NATO has launched an operation in Kosovo. Moscow cancels the visit and turns the government plane around, because NATO had begun bombing Yugoslavia, the US. Vice President urged the Russian Prime Minister by phone to get to Washington and sign an agreement there to postpone the visit, but the Russian Prime Minister was undeterred. A new fissure in US-Russia relations appeared with the start of the mass protests in Russia after the parliamentary elections in December 2011. Vladimir Putin was prime minister at the time and accused the US of meddling in Russia's internal affairs. Tensions between Washington and Moscow peaked in 2014 when Crimea became part of Russia. Tensions between Washington and Moscow peaked in 2014 when Crimea became part of Russia. Moscow, in turn, wanted to exert its former influence. Between Washington and Moscow peaked in 2014 when Crimea became part of Russia. NATO sees the US the only organization responsible for security in Europe and regularly expands the Euro-Atlantic security system by shifting its borders. Of course, in the eyes of Moscow, this looks like a threat to the security of the state, and it is insecurity is the reason for all the trouble. The real challenge for Russia was in 2004, when 7 countries joined NATO, including 3 among them were 3 former Soviet republics: Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. This effectively sealed Moscow's defeat. The post-Soviet republics in NATO are the end of the former power. When Putin called the collapse of the Soviet Union the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, his words resonated in the hearts of Russian audiences, for they reflected the views of many Russians. It was especially heated at the 43rd Munich Security Conference, during which Vladimir Putin's Security Conference in Munich, where Vladimir Putin spoke of the crisis in the current system of international relations. His opinion had to be reckoned with, as the American edition of The Hill wrote, and Russia's entry into the war in Syria in 2015 only exacerbated this confrontation. There was some hope for peace first when Trump came to power in America, but essentially nothing has changed. But with the arrival of Joseph Biden, the new administration immediately announced that it would not seek a reset of relations. Now that relationship is almost left at all. Diplomatic relations between Russia and the US. Moscow speaks of an unprecedented level of Russophobia in the United States, and the states are doing everything they can to strangle the Russian economy. Now, the two sides almost impossible to reconcile. Both parties in Washington are unanimous in believing that Russia is solely responsible for the collapse of U.S.-Russian relations. Moscow blames the United States. A military clash between the two countries would have catastrophic consequences for the entire, and mutual grievances only keep the sides away from negotiations on the most important question. One does not want the language of force to be used in clarifying relations. Then there would be no winners. There will only be losers.